What is the principle of returning to origin? Welcome to Philosopher's Corner. I'm John. What is the principle of returning to origin? Well, as we covered it in Life is a Series of Chain of Events, which describes cause and effect, we find out that life is a series of causation of an event and something happening because of the event, and then a chain of events occurring, cause and effect. And we discussed the fact that because the universe runs that way, we can be in the present moment and we can follow that chain backwards. We can back engineer it from the effects to get to the cause. And amongst that chain, there are many causes, things that have happened. But an important guiding principle in the concentration of our mind is the origin. The origin is the source event of the chain of cause and effects that we're examining. And in this principle of return to origin, it gives us a mental template of how to focus on events, because we're so deep into time as defined by all of the events and effects that have happened physically in space since the inception of creation. And there are so many chains of events, and chains of events inevitably spiderweb out. So you can have one cause, and then it causes an effect, and then even after the first effect, that effect then becomes a cause of other things, and there can be multiple things coming off of that effect, and so on and so forth, so that one cause, one origin, can be responsible for innumerable effects. And that's one of the areas of study of probabilistic determination, probabilities and statistics, future modeling projections, when you're doing it from the present moment and you're looking outwards of all of the possible permutations of one cause, which is the origin of that particular projection, of that series of cause and effects that ensue. So in the principle of return to origin, we are focusing our minds to try to go back from our present position in time to follow a coherent, logical set of effects to their preceding cause back to origin, whatever the origin of that event is. Now, this principle can be applied to any particular circumstance. Police detectives do it every day. When they show up to investigate a crime, their task is to be in the present moment and see what has occurred, what they're left with, what the evidence is, and then they are tasked to go back through the series of the chain of events to find the origin. In their case, the criminal, the crime scene, what happened there, and then to further go back into the criminal to find the criminal. And they go so far as to, that's why they have psychological profilers, right? In murder cases, they have people who study the psychological profiles of people who would engage in homicides. They're trying to get to the origin of homicide in general. It's starting at the psychological level, right? And that can be done for literally anything. You can come into a situation and say, I want to see how, these birds were born. I want to know more about fill in the blank. And from small to big picture items, it helps concentrate the mind for a return to origin. We all seem to be programmed with a return to origin, right? Like salmon famously, they're born, they spawn, they go have a salmon life, and then at a certain point in their biology, when they feel it and it's time to go engage in procreation, they have a built-in GPS that tells them you're going to go back to your spawning ground, back to where you were created, back to your origin. And they literally and famously swim upstream against all the hazards, literally jumping up waterfalls and making incredible athletic, acrobatic, against the odds journeys back to their spawning grounds just to lay more eggs, just to get involved, just to procreate, back to where from whence they came, to their origin. It's programmed into them. And that type of behavior can be seen in animals from the full spectrum of life here on Earth. And it certainly resonates with humans, because when we look at the full spectrum of humanity and we see that, especially, since we're doing philosophy in the intellectual realm, so many of the great thinkers and great minds of the human species have meditated and dwelt on the fact of what is our origin. And that takes many causes, right? There's the human cause of what's our real human history, what's the origin of humanity, and that takes a lot of different things. It's what's the origin of human civilization, what's the origin of human ability, what's the origin of human evolution, what's the origin of humans being on the planet at all, for starters, right? And those are just the material, physical levels of origin of questions that we're trying to discover. And we go through the same process of essentially backwards engineering from one moment to the preceding cause, to the preceding cause, to the preceding cause. And we try to verify it and get evidence of each backwards jump in the timeline to go, oh yeah, that's really what happened, all the way through our history. And they try to do it according to the scientific method, which is a great method when used properly. And it takes us on a backwards walk through time, trying to get to origin. That's just on the physical level. And then obviously on the metaphysical and spiritual level, trying to combine all these things of origin, of life in general, but specific to humans. Okay, so if humanity is a spiritually aware creation, then how do we backwards engineer that to origin? And then that leads great thinkers through time, through all sorts of realms and all sorts of dimensions and all sorts of different causations, because they're trying to return to origin. They know it's deep inside each one of us, and every one of us can feel it. Every one of us knows that there is a place from which we originated. Now, the questions and the answers and the discoveries along that way, they all vary. They're innumerable. Everybody's got different opinions. Now, there are resounding amounts of data sets that correlate independently from around the world based on these searches. But for the sake of this discussion, I think the important theme here is that humans throughout the planet, throughout the timeline, throughout every permutation of the culture, whether it's free, suppressed, doesn't matter, whether it's a codified civilization or aboriginal nomad types, every single human being has demonstrated the principle of return to origin. Now, certain different humans have different abilities to be able to engage in it, and some come back with different answers, and but a lot of them come back with the same answers. But the important part here is to discern the fact that this return to origin is a universal human quality. Now that's on the big picture of creation. Who made us? Like, what made us? Why are we here? All those things that we try to use it for. But it's an autonomic thought process that occurs in our brains when we're just walking around. It's a part of the human thought process that seems to have just been put into us as a standard operating system. Some part of our mind knows the relation of physical items to time and space. And it knows that if something is here, it means that it has a forensic history to it. And the more that we become conscious of that, and the more that we open up our other senses and give our senses permission to know that that's true about every single thing that we encounter, that it has a history to it of cause and effect, and it has an origin, then more information can be interacted between us and whatever it is. When I say object, that covers anything in the material reality, be it animate, inanimate, visible, invisible to the visual eye, the whole shebang, all of it. And I believe it's at that moment when the energy can flow a lot better with that connection with the reality, to know that everything is intertwined in these living algorithms. And these living algorithms are really causes and effects. But the way for our mind, for the rational side of our mind, to be able to put a frame around each object to give it sort of a time integrity, to know that everything has an origin, and to know that everything has a place in this time-space dimension that we're in, that helps give the rational mind a frame for every single thing in the reality. And it satiates that part to know, yes, if you really want to focus on any part of the reality, and you want to give it the full power of your concentration, and concentration is one of the great powers of humanity. And if you want to concentrate on a thing, and you have this frame, this framework that everything has an origin, and you can return to origin, and you can do it with a well-trained mind, you can follow it back. Then when we walk around the reality, it brings everything much more into sharper clarity, because now it just isn't a collection of random items in the environment that don't have any organization. This helps give respect and acknowledgement and clarity to everything in the reality, because we as an object are no different than all the other objects in the reality. We have sentience, and we have consciousness, and we have reality, but in terms of this time-space dimension, we're stuffed into a little body, and our little body is adhering to the same rules of physics and causes and effects and all these other things as all the other objects in the reality. And in a way, when we can go around with that conscious framework in our mind, it has a very equalizing effect on it, and it can really center us in the physical material reality. And then things can really open up, because then we can really see things for what they are. The vibes get better. The vibe of the respect and of the communication from ourselves into the universal environment causes reflexivity, which one can experience for themselves. I know I can't, in philosophy terms, I can't defend that on a thesis level, but we can get into that later. But when one comes into clarity and is allowed to have a rational framework for all the other objects, then there's a sense that they also feel that in the person. It's no different than if I come up to you and you can tell before I open my mouth, if I have respect for you, if I just respect you, like have a baseline of respect for you as a fellow human being. Like, oh, you're a human being, you deserve a certain baseline of respect and dignity from me before you even open up your mouth. Now it can vary once, if you open up your mouth and say something terrible and you have, an ill heart and bad intentions, then of course that's going to change the metric. But that's case by case basis. You can tell before we say anything if I have a feeling of respect for you, and that respect comes at a basic level of, I know that you have an origin and that you're in this reality in the same manner that I am. And in the principle of return to origin, if we put that framework around every object in the reality, then the respect and the clarity can really open up, and information and energies can flow a lot better, and new permutations of life and reality can open up. And of course, if we want to bring our intellectual powers to bear, we can have a ton of fun exploring up and down the timeline of objects and effects and events and seeing which way, how it went, this way, that way. And I think it's a really key thought to be able to navigate the multidimensional aspect of the universe, because different dimensions have different time cycles, different time rates, and it can be very confusing. Anybody who's done psychedelic drugs, and there's other ways to get to altered states of consciousness, like breathing exercises and yogic practices, all sorts of different ways, like cold baths, and there's a million different ways. But psychedelics are obviously like an easy, hard trigger to get into areas of altered states of perception where you get to experience different time rates occurring. And you realize that these time rates give you different ratios of information download relative to your baseline here in the third dimension. Return to principle origin, when you're in those other time cycles, lets you deal with the time cycle difference easier, because oh, well, we're getting a sequence of more information at a faster rate compared to time on the clock than I am in my normal reality. And all of these information sequences, when you keep your mind focused on return to origin of things, they allow you to not have your mind short-circuited, because now you have an organizational framework for what you're seeing, because it's returning, you're going through like a series of cause and effects of a particular topic, an issue, an area, whatever it is, and you're returning through to the origin of things, right? And the origin is interchangeable with source. You can call it the source of a thing or the origin of a thing, and that's where it emanates from. And then that can provide clarity. And when you get to the source of the thing, the origin of the thing, you've completed a cycle. Now, cycle completion is all case-by-case basis, but when you do a cycle completion of something, it becomes obvious to the person who has completed that cycle. That person knows. It's very obvious. There are unique telltale signs when cycle completion occurs, and then it becomes part of you. When cycle completion occurs, then it becomes a solid part of you and gets integrated into your soul somehow. I'm not sure how yet. Feels like it hangs out in your field like a little piece of information in a hard drive, and then you can continue on, whether it's big or small or whatever. But it's a helpful tool, and I think it's a good intellectual principle to keep in mind when navigating the reality, and especially when in highly concentrated intellectual pursuits for particular informations or particular discoveries, intellectual queries. Certainly for philosophical exercises, it's really good, because you have to know where's your stopping point in information search. And when you reach the origin of something, the source of something, well, you can't go beyond that. That's your stopping point. That's your cyclical completion point. Well, thanks for spending some time here at Philosopher's Corner. I hope you found this helpful. And as always, have fun.